Quote, this largely aligns with our vision. Not one single time in the last 80 years would you think that sentence would come from the Kremlin in reference to us, the United States of America, and our foreign policy until today. Those words are from a Kremlin spokesperson in reference to Friday's Oval Office ambush of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky by Donald J. Trump and J.D. Vance, what is seen as a gift to Putin's regime. And they're not our words. This is the words that members of Russian media are using to describe what happened Friday. And it is part of a chain reaction of events, serving only to confirm that in the eyes of the Kremlin, a realignment that works for them, not necessarily us, has already taken place. One Russian editor telling the Washington Post this, quote, we don't even have to step in. We can just retransmit what the Americans are saying. He notes that Putin had smartly withheld comment on Friday's meeting and could afford to stay silent for now. Quote, the public will conclude that our leaders were correct in their assessment of Zelensky as a leader of Ukraine. This is a huge gift for them. That Oval Office ambush, apparently just one of many gifts from Donald Trump to Vladimir Putin. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has ordered a stop to all offensive cyber operations against Russia. It's what the New York Times describes this way, quote, as part of a broader effort to draw President Vladimir Putin of Russia into talks on Ukraine and a new relationship with the U.S. The pause could, though, have the consequence of leaving the United States blind as they head into talks with Putin. The Times reporting this, quote, retaining access to major Russian networks for espionage purposes is critical to understanding Putin's intentions as he enters negotiations into tracking arguments within Russia about what conditions to insist upon and what could be given up. And then there are the other rhetorical gifts that Trump delivered to Putin as well. Here's National Security Advisor to Trump, Mike Waltz, who once compared President Zelensky to Winston Churchill. Now this.
If we want to do a history lesson on Churchill, that he stood and fought for his people. President Zelensky stood and fought for Ukraine. But Churchill was also voted out of office in 1945. He was a man for a moment, but he did not then transition England into the next phase. And it's unclear whether President Zelensky, particularly after what we saw Friday, is ready to transition to Ukraine to an end to this war and to negotiate and have to compromise.
Are you suggesting that President Trump wants Zelensky to resign?
We need a leader that can deal with us, eventually deal with the Russians, and end this war. And if it becomes apparent that President Zelensky's either personal motivations or political motivations are divergent from ending the fighting in his country, then I think we have a real issue on our hands.
Again, to be clear, what happened Friday was President Zelensky simply trying to insert facts into that admonition that J.D. Vance and Donald Trump tried to deliver. But that there from Mr. Waltz is a stunning thing for anyone to say, especially someone who once said the U.S. had to do anything and everything it could do to keep Zelensky alive. Donald Trump kept it up this morning. He piled on by suggesting that Zelensky doesn't want peace. He said, quote, America will not put up with it much longer. It was after Zelensky said that the end of the war was still, quote, very, very far away. Team Trump's attempted realignment with Russia is being met with resistance in many forms and shapes. J.D. Vance was greeted by protesters on Saturday during a ski trip to Vermont. Local paper, the Vermont Digger, captured images of people holding signs. Some of them read, quote, Vance is a traitor, go ski in Russia, and Trump serves Putin. And this one, J.D. Vance, Zelensky is 10 times the man you are. That is where we start today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. Former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, now non-resident senior fellow in the foreign policy program at the Brookings Institution, Ambassador Stephen Pifer is here. Also joining us, Peter Baker. He's the chief White House correspondent for the New York Times. With me at the table for the hour, former Democratic Senator, MSNBC political analyst Claire McCaskill joins us as well. Peter Baker, you've written some things that, even as daily newspaper stories, feel like they're written for history as the history is being made. But I want to harken back to something you wrote last week about how Washington had taken on a chill that reminded you of the time you and your wife spent as journalists in Moscow. I believe you wrote that sentence before the Oval Office blow up, but I wonder if you could pull that thread through what you saw Friday and over the weekend.
Yeah, what's kind of astonishing is we're seeing this Putin influence in effect both at home and abroad, right? So what I was writing about was the feeling in Washington these days that reminded us of Putin's early years in Moscow when we were correspondents there. We were there from the end of 2000 to the end of 2004. And in that period of time, just over 4 years, you saw how much things were changing. Putin had just come to power. He was consolidating control. He was neutering contrary forces in society, like the news media, like the oligarchs, like the parliament, any other source of potential dissent or opposition. Piece by piece was being dismantled as he eventually took over what would become a much more authoritarian state even after we left. And what we see in Washington these days feels familiar in a lot of ways. People who used to talk to us openly, who would be on the record saying critical things of President Trump, now don't want to be on the record, don't want to be probably on your show as much, probably don't want their names to be used because they're feeling a certain fear factor. And we see the president trying to take over the press pool in the White House, putting a lot of pressure on media companies, putting pressure on, enemies through the Justice Department, firing people who he perceives to be enemies, and taking a lot of authority to himself that hasn't traditionally been in the hands of the president. So that was before Friday's Oval Office thing, as you say. And then all this is happening against the backdrop of a pivot on the foreign policy sense to a much more pro-Russia point of view. That a lot of things that Trump is saying these days about Ukraine are exactly the things you hear Moscow saying.
Peter, I've had an opposite experience with people not being willing to speak out. It's exclusive to the Republican Party. And what I've witnessed is men who as recently as 10 days ago, 12 days ago, 2 days ago, were praising Zelensky, now agree with Donald Trump's attempt to remake him as some sort of American nemesis as opposed to an archetype. Can you just say more about the kinds of people or their ideological affiliation or their relationship to Trump, where you're finding people unwilling to speak out?
Well, obviously, it's probably more Republicans, like you say, particularly Republicans who have any hope of an elected future. People who used to work for him, who were critical of him after he left office. Some people even who quit his administration spoke out but are now nervous about it. They don't want to have their heads up. They're worried about Kash Patel at the FBI, who's already, of course, come up with a list of 60 people he considers to be deep state agents that is perceived to be an enemies list. These are people who, had been in government and often were quite vocal about what they saw happening in the first term, but this time I think are nervous. I hear him say, look, I've got a son who works in the government. I've got a daughter who has a grant. I've got a family, I'm heading toward retirement. That was what was happening to us in Moscow. People who talked to us when we first got there by the end said, we just really don't want to take that chance.
Mr. Ambassador, your thoughts on the significance of what happened on Friday and this culture of fear, a direct consequence of the promises of retribution, I'm sure, but also Trump's intention to scare people out of speaking out.
Yeah, no, I mean, we haven't seen anything in the Oval Office that like we saw on Friday. And it clearly was, I think, an ambush by the vice president and the president to humiliate Zelensky. My question is, why are we doing that to the leader of a country that has been a good partner now for 30 years? And look, this idea that Zelensky doesn't want peace is just nonsense. He's had 3 years of every night his cities are getting bombed and rocketed. His soldiers are getting killed every day on the front line. He wants peace, but he doesn't want a peace that will prove false. So the president did not give him a chance to explain what his objection was just to a ceasefire. But Ukraine from 2014, when Russia seized part of Donbass in eastern Ukraine, it had a series of ceasefires from 2014 to 2022. The Russians regularly violated those ceasefires, and Ukraine didn't get back a single square foot of land that was on the other side of that contact line. And I think that's Zelensky's fear, is if he signs up just to a ceasefire, then there's no further negotiation. Russia has the land. Russia has the ability to regroup, rearm, and then violate the ceasefire at a time of its own choosing. So what he's looking for, and I think what he came to Washington was hoping for, some kind of a security commitment. Because if he makes a agreement in which he has to accept that his land is lost, at least temporarily. He said he'll never formally accept that that land is no longer Ukrainian. But he did say last year he was prepared to agree that Ukraine would not use military force to try to reacquire that land. But in order to sell that to a good part of his constituency at home, he has to have something, and he needs, I think, some kind of a security commitment. And unfortunately, the White House purposely, to my mind, blew up that meeting before they could have that conversation. And there's just one last comment, Nicole. You were at the White House. When I was at the White House back in the 90s, a press pool spray in the Oval Office is typically like 4 or 5 minutes. You get a picture of the two leaders, they say hello, they take 1 or 2 questions. This press spray went for almost 50 minutes, and it cut into the time that they could have had a discussion or even an argument behind closed doors, which is where it should have taken place.
You said the question today is why. I mean, what is your answer to that question privately when people call and ask you why? Why would Trump do this?
My answer is why I think Donald Trump dislikes Volodymyr Zelensky. And I think it goes back to his first term. Remember that so-called perfect phone call that took place, and then Trump suspended aid to Ukraine, and that led to his first impeachment. Zelensky was the target of Trump's extortion attempt. But I think in Trump's mind, Zelensky is somewhat responsible for that first impeachment. What's harder for me to figure out is Trump's affinity, his admiration, his liking for Vladimir Putin. If you go back over the past 10, 11 years, you'll not find any instances where Trump has criticized Putin or Putin's actions, even though there is plenty to criticize. And that's much harder for me to understand.